I was still wearing a hospital bracelet the day I found out my daughter had sold my house. Not packed my things, not moved my furniture into storage, not put up a for sale sign and called to warn me. Sold it, signed a preliminary agreement, transferred authority, collected the deposit, all while I was lying in a cardiac care unit 3 miles away, hooked to monitors, unable to speak above a whisper, trusting completely and foolishly trusting that the family I had spent my entire life building would take care of things while I couldn't. Her name was on the paperwork, her signature on every document. The new owners were already scheduled to move in. What Patricia did not know, what she had never once thought to look for in all her calculating and planning, was that in 1987 her father had quietly filed one single piece of paper with the county recorder's office. A document so small, so easy to overlook, so invisible to someone who never asked about the years before they started wanting things, that it had sat in a manila folder in a desk drawer for 36 years without anyone disturbing it. She thought she had taken everything. She had left me the one thing that made it impossible. My name is Eleanor. I am 71 years old. I was a 4th grade school teacher for 32 years, a wife for 40, and a widow for 9. For most of my life I was also a woman who believed, without question, that the word family meant something, that a daughter was not an adversary in waiting, that the years you spend feeding and teaching and sitting up late with a sick child created a debt of loyalty that could not simply be erased when the child grew up and got a real estate license and started looking at your house with eyes that were doing arithmetic. I was wrong about that, but only about one of my children. I want to tell you something before I go any further, because there are people listening to this who are already nodding, who have felt the thing I am about to describe, that particular stillness that comes over you when someone you love says something that sounds almost reasonable, and your mind smiles and says, of course, and your gut says, wait. If you know that feeling, this story is for you, and I need you to stay with me all the way to the end, because what happened in that desk drawer matters in ways that go beyond the story of one house on one street. There is something in here that could protect you, or someone you love, and I am going to make sure you have it before we're done. But first, I need you to understand what was at stake. My late husband Gerald and I bought that house in 1974. We were young and not particularly flush. Gerald worked for the telephone company. I taught school. Between us, we had exactly enough for a 10% down payment on a 30-year mortgage at 8.5% interest, which in 1974 felt crushing and also miraculous because it was ours. We painted every room ourselves, the two of us on a weekend, Gerald on the ladder, me cutting in along the baseboards, the radio going in the next room. We planted the oak tree in the backyard the summer Dennis was born. We repaired the porch steps twice, replaced the furnace once, refinished the hardwood floors the year Gerald retired, and spent 30 years building a life inside those walls that could not be measured in square footage. When Gerald died of a sudden heart attack 9 years ago, I stayed. Everyone expected me to sell. My sister thought the house was too large for one person. My accountant mentioned that the neighborhood had appreciated. Several of my friends, kindly and with love, pointed out that a smaller place would be easier. I could not do it. The house was not a financial asset to be optimized. It was the last place on earth where Gerald still existed in any meaningful way. His workshop in the basement, tools hung in the order he had always kept them, a coffee can of screws on the workbench, his coffee cup in the cabinet, 3rd shelf, right side. The slight depression in his side of the mattress, permanent now, that I had never been able to bring myself to correct by rotating the bed. I was not ready to leave those things, and I had decided, quietly, that I did not have to be. I had 2 children. My son Dennis lives in Portland, Oregon. He calls every Sunday without fail. Every Sunday for 9 years since his father died. He drives out to visit 3 or 4 times a year and once flew home on 48 hours' notice because I mentioned, almost in passing, that I had been feeling run down. He is not a wealthy man. He has 2 kids of his own, a mortgage of his own, a life that does not have a lot of spare room in it. He makes the room anyway. He has never given me a single reason to question his character. My daughter Patricia lives 12 minutes from my house. She has a real estate license, a second husband named Robert who calls me Eleanor instead of Mom and has been doing so for 6 years without correction, and an appetite for other people's things that I had been quietly watching develop since she was in her mid-30s. She visits when she needs something. She calls when she wants information. She is charming, Patricia, genuinely charming, in the way that certain people are charming as a tool, not a nature. I want to be fair. In her early years, Patricia was a devoted daughter. She helped when Gerald was sick without being asked. She came to every holiday, called reliably, was present in the ways that count when someone you love is dying. Whatever turned in her, and something did turn, I watched it turned gradually, somewhere around the time she started studying for her real estate license. Somewhere around the time she began walking through rooms and seeing assets where other people saw walls. I missed it at first. Then I saw it and decided not to show that I had seen it. That decision, it turns out, was the right one. The first sign came about 4 years ago. I was sitting at Patricia's kitchen table one afternoon. I had driven over to drop off a birthday gift for her younger daughter, and she mentioned, very casually, in the tone you might use to comment on the weather, that the neighborhood my house sat in had appreciated considerably. She said a house 2 streets over had just sold for a figure that surprised her. She said property in that corridor was moving fast. I said that was nice to hear. I changed the subject. I drove home and wrote it down in the small spiral notebook I kept in my nightstand. The date. Her exact words, the way her eyes had looked while she said them, not warm, not conversational. Calculating. Doing sums. I had started keeping the notebook 6 months earlier, for reasons I could not fully articulate then. Call it the school teacher in me. You learn, after 3 decades of watching children, to notice the difference between what someone says and what someone means. You learn to wait and watch and gather evidence before you draw a conclusion. I did not know yet what the notebook would become. I only knew that something in me had decided to start paying attention. The second sign came about 18 months later, and it was subtler and more alarming. Patricia called on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual. She generally texted unless she wanted something, and she said she had been reading about seniors and estate planning. She had come across an article, she said, about families who were left in difficult positions because their parents had waited too long to make arrangements. She thought it might be worth my while to think about what she called the property situation. Maybe put it in a trust. Maybe, and this was the word she used, simplify. I asked her what she meant by simplify. She said she just wanted what was best for me. I told her I would think about it. I said it warmly. I served myself more tea. And I thought, there it is. There is the thing I have been watching approach. She has moved from noticing to nudging. The notebook now had 2 entries. The third sign came the following spring, at Easter dinner. Patricia arrived with Robert, who shook my hand at the door rather than embracing me, which he had been doing for years and which I had stopped noticing until that day I suddenly noticed it again. She brought a bottle of wine she knew I didn't drink and a dessert she knew I was allergic to. And midway through the meal, in front of everyone at the table including Dennis, who had driven up from Portland for the holiday, Patricia asked whether I had given any more thought to the property situation. Dennis set down his fork. He went very still in the particular way that Dennis goes still, not dramatically, not making a scene, just suddenly, completely quiet. The way a man goes quiet when he is paying close attention to something that concerns him. I said, pleasantly, that I hadn't made any decisions and wasn't planning to any time soon. Patricia smiled the smile she uses when she wants to appear patient. Robert reached across and refilled his own wineglass without being asked. That night, after they had gone, Dennis sat with me in the living room. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Mom, has she done anything I should know about?" I told him I didn't think so. Not yet. He looked at me steadily. He said, "But you're watching." I said, "I've been watching for a while now." He nodded. He understood that. He went back to Portland the next morning, and we did not speak of it further. But from that Easter forward, the notebook entries became more detailed, dates and exact words and the small gestures, the particular way Patricia would glance around a room when she visited, the questions she asked about the roof, the foundation, the HVAC system. Questions that sounded like neighborly interest and were not. Now I need to tell you about the document. You have been patient, and you deserve to understand what it is. But I need you to have one more piece of context first, because the document only makes sense if you know where it came from. In the spring of 1987, Gerald and I were going through a financially uncomfortable stretch. Nothing catastrophic, a bad investment, an unexpected repair, the ordinary weight of 2 children in school, and a mortgage and a life being lived on 2 working-class salaries with no margin for error. That spring a man came to our door representing a company that offered sale-leaseback arrangements to homeowners who needed cash. "You sell us your house," they would say, "we give you the proceeds, and then you rent it from us and stay in the home as a tenant." Gerald sent him away. But the visit made Gerald uneasy in a way that stayed with him for weeks. Gerald was a careful man, not suspicious by nature, but thorough. He read every document he signed. He had a lawyer friend, a quiet man named Hal, who had handled our original closing, and he called Hal the following week and described the situation and asked whether there was any legal mechanism that would prevent such a thing from ever being done against his wife's wishes. Hal told him about a life estate. I need to explain this properly, because this is the piece that will matter to you. A life estate is a legal instrument recorded in the county deed records that establishes a specific person called the life tenant as having the permanent legal right to occupy and control a property for the duration of their natural life. It is not a claim. It is not a preference. It is a recorded property right, as real and as binding as the deed itself. Once it is filed, any subsequent transfer, sale, or transaction involving that property must account for the life tenant's rights. A buyer cannot take clean title to a property subject to a life estate without the life tenant's participation and consent. The interest simply cannot be conveyed without it. This has been settled law for centuries. It is one of the oldest and most robust protections in property law. Hal drew up the instrument. It named me as the life tenant. Gerald signed it as the property owner. Hal had it notarized, and in September of 1987, Gerald drove to the county recorder's office and paid a $40 filing fee to have it entered into the public property records. Then he came home, put the original in a manila folder, labeled the folder in his neat and careful handwriting, and placed it in the second drawer of his desk. He never mentioned it again. I had no reason to think about it. Life was full and busy and good, and we were not people who spent our days preparing for betrayals that had not happened yet. Gerald died 9 years ago. His desk stayed in his office. The folder stayed in the drawer, in his handwriting, with the county recording stamp on the document inside. 36 years of accumulated quiet. Patricia, in all her research and all her planning, had never thought to look. Now I need to tell you what happened when I was in the hospital, and I need to ask you to sit with this, because for me this is still the part that takes the longest to say. It began on a Tuesday morning in October, a year and a half ago. I had been feeling unusual pressure in my chest for several days. I had attributed it to stress, which was reasonable, because the weeks before had been stressful. Patricia had made 3 separate attempts that fall to get me to sign a broad financial power of attorney that would have named her as my sole decision-maker for property and banking. I had not signed it. I had read each version carefully, thanked her pleasantly, said I wanted more time to review it, and written down every visit in my notebook. The third attempt had been 10 days earlier. Patricia arrived unannounced on a Saturday with a revised document and a different notary, a woman this time, older, professional, who complimented my kitchen and handed me a pen in a way that suggested this was all entirely routine. I read the document. The revisions were cosmetic. The authority it granted Patricia was essentially unchanged from the first version, sweeping, broad, unreviewable. I set the pen down. I said pleasantly that I still wasn't comfortable signing that day. Patricia set her coffee cup down. With a small, precise movement I recognized from her childhood the gesture she made when she was trying not to show that she was angry. She left within the hour. I sat at my kitchen table after she drove away, and I wrote in my notebook, "Third attempt." No signature obtained. She is running out of patience. 8 days later, the chest pressure became something I could not ignore. My neighbor Ruth drove me to the emergency room at 10 in the morning. By noon, I was in the cardiac care unit with a diagnosis of a significant arrhythmia requiring immediate medication and monitoring. I was not in mortal danger, but I was sedated and confused and unable to hold a phone conversation for the better part of 5 days. I was, for those 5 days, effectively gone. I need you to understand what 5 days means to someone who has been planning carefully for a window. Ruth called Dennis the moment she got home from the hospital. Dennis booked a flight that same evening. Patricia had been notified by the hospital as my emergency contact. Dennis arrived on day 3. He went to the house, which he had a key to. He found a staging coordinator standing in my kitchen with a clipboard. He found a cleaning crew moving through the bedrooms. He found a locksmith in the entryway. When Dennis asked the woman with the clipboard who she was, she told him she was preparing the property for showing. He asked who had hired her. She showed him a signed contract. The signature was Patricia's. Dennis called Patricia. She told him, calmly and without hesitation, that she had found a buyer and signed a preliminary agreement, that the market timing was right, and that the proceeds would go toward my care. She said this as though it were reasonable, as though the fact that I was alive and sedated 3 miles away in a house I had lived in for 50 years was a logistical detail rather than a reason to stop. Dennis called me at the hospital. I could barely hold the phone. He told me in the steadiest voice he could manage that Patricia had entered into a preliminary purchase agreement on the house without my knowledge or consent, and that I needed to tell him what to do. And through the medication and the monitors and the fear, I thought about Gerald. I thought about the afternoon in 1987 when a man came to our door and made Gerald uneasy, and about the phone call to Hal that followed, and about the $40 filing fee and the manila folder in the second drawer. I had not thought about that document in 30 years. I said 4 words. Second drawer. Gerald's desk. Dennis set down the phone and walked back through my house, past the staging coordinator and her clipboard, down the hall to Gerald's office, and opened the second drawer. He found the folder exactly where it had been since September of 1987. He called me back. He read me the document. I heard Gerald's language, careful and precise, my name written 3 times as life tenant, the recording stamp, the date. September 12th, 1987. A life tenant must consent to any full conveyance of the property. Without that consent, any purported sale is legally incomplete. A buyer cannot receive clear, marketable title. No title company will insure it. No lender will finance it. The transaction simply cannot close. I said, call a property attorney tonight, not tomorrow. Tonight, Dennis said, I already have one on the phone. That is my son. That is what 36 years of quiet planning looked like the moment it was needed. I want to be precise about what happened next, because this is not a story of dramatic courtroom confrontations. It is a story of paperwork meeting paperwork and the right paperwork winning. The attorney Dennis retained that night was a woman named Cynthia, a property law specialist whose manner I was told was calm to the point of being almost serene, and whose letters, I later learned, tended to arrive like a stone dropped into still water. Within 48 hours of being retained, she obtained a certified copy of the life estate from the county recorder's office because it was a matter of public record, because it had been there since 1987, because Gerald had paid $40 to make it permanent, and she sent formal written notice to every party in the preliminary transaction. Patricia's buyer's agent. The buyer, the title company. Patricia herself. The notice did not threaten. It did not argue. It simply stated, as a matter of recorded property law, that the property was subject to a life estate, that the life tenant was alive and had not consented to any transfer, and that any purported conveyance was therefore legally defective and could not result in marketable title. The buyer's agent withdrew her client from the transaction within the hour. She recognized immediately what she was looking at. A life estate recorded in 1987 predated the preliminary agreement by 36 years. There was no dispute to be had. The sale had never had a legal foundation to stand on. Patricia's preliminary agreement became unenforceable paper. The staging coordinator was dismissed. The cleaning crew left my house. The locksmith's work was undone. The house went back to silence. I want to tell you about the consequences for Patricia, because they are part of this story and they matter. Attorney Cynthia filed a formal complaint with the State Real Estate Licensing Board. Patricia held a real estate license. She had, as a licensed agent, participated in the attempted transfer of a property to which she had no authority, representing it to a buyer without disclosing a recorded encumbrance that was available in the public deed records. Failure to disclose a known title defect is a material misrepresentation. It is one of the most serious violations a licensed agent can commit, and every state licensing board treats it accordingly. The board investigated. In most states, this process takes between 3 and 6 months. At the end of it, Patricia's license was suspended, and she was required to complete mandatory ethics education before it could be reinstated. The record of the suspension became part of the permanent public licensing file, which in real estate means it follows an agent for the life of their career and must be disclosed on every future license renewal application. The fine that accompanied it was not trivial. Robert, who had signed a witness line on one of the preliminary documents and had co-authorized the earnest money deposit, lost that deposit when the transaction was voided. $11,000 gone. Patricia had been working under the umbrella of a brokerage firm. When the nature of the complaint became clear, she was quietly asked not to renew her association with the office. This is standard in brokerage relationships. A firm carries liability for its agent's conduct, and an agent under a licensing board investigation for misrepresentation of title is a liability no brokerage wants to carry. A civil demand letter from Attorney Cynthia addressed the funds Patricia had prematurely moved. Those funds were returned within 60 days. I was discharged from the hospital 11 days after I was admitted. Dennis drove me home. We pulled into my driveway, and I sat in the passenger seat for a moment, looking at the house. The oak tree in the backyard, bare in October, enormous now, the way oak trees get when they have had 50 years to decide what they want to be. The porch Gerald and I had repaired twice. The windows I had painted the summer we did the exterior, the two of us, the radio going. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. Triumph would have required the situation to have been foreign to me, something I had never imagined happening. This was not that. This was a thing I had seen coming for 4 years, a thing I had watched approach and prepared for, and hoped would not arrive, and had it arrive anyway. What I felt was something older and heavier than triumph. A grief mostly for the version of Patricia I had loved when she was young, and a tired and durable gratitude for Gerald, who had been gone 9 years and had still, somehow, managed to protect me. Dennis carried my bag inside. He had cleaned the house in the days I was in the hospital, quietly undone the staging crew's rearrangements, put everything back where it belonged. He had made my bed. I want to tell you about Ruth, my neighbor, because this story does not end with a document. It ends with people. Ruth has lived next door to me for 17 years. She is 74 years old. She was a nurse for 30 years. She drives too fast. She gardens with an aggression I have always found amusing. And she makes a banana bread that I have been trying and failing to replicate for a decade. She was the person who drove me to the hospital that Tuesday morning, and she was also, it turned out, the person who narrowed the window Patricia had been counting on. When Patricia's cleaning crew and locksmith arrived at my house that day, Ruth was in her front yard. She watched. She recognized wrong the way 30 years of nursing teaches you to recognize wrong quietly, quickly, without drama. She called Dennis before Dennis had called her. She had his number because I had given it to her 3 years earlier and asked her to use it if she ever saw something at my house that didn't sit right with her. Dennis received Ruth's call 4 hours before he had planned to book his flight. He arrived at my house that afternoon instead of the following morning. That 4 hours mattered. It mattered because Patricia's preliminary agreement had not yet been fully countersigned by all parties. It mattered because it gave Attorney Cynthia the window she needed to move before the transaction could progress further. It mattered because Dennis was standing in my house, in Gerald's office, with the folder in his hand before anyone had thought to go through the drawers. A $40 document. A neighbor who was paying attention. A son who answered the phone and got on a plane. Ruth does not think she did anything remarkable. She thinks she was just paying attention, which is what she has always done. She told me afterward over coffee at my kitchen table, "Eleanor, I've been a neighbor to a lot of people. When something feels wrong, you say something. That's all." I think about that sometimes, when people ask me what I would tell someone who is worried about this kind of thing happening to them. I tell them 2 things. The first is to find a property attorney you trust and ask them about the legal tools available to protect your home, not because you expect the worst from your family, but because the people who love you most will thank you for having thought of it. A life estate, a living trust, a transfer on death deed, these instruments are not complicated or expensive, and they are far easier to put in place while everything is calm than to rely on in a crisis. The second thing I tell them is, get a Ruth. Not metaphorically. Literally, identify the person in your life who has been paying attention to the world for decades and still believes it matters to say something when something is wrong. That person is worth more than any document. Because the document only saves you if someone notices in time to use it. I want to tell you about the letter, because the letter is the part of this story I have thought about most. 11 months after everything happened, I received a handwritten letter from Patricia. 3 pages in her handwriting, which I recognize as well as my own. She said she was sorry. She said she had not been thinking clearly, that she had convinced herself it was the right thing, that Robert had been pushing her and she had let herself be pushed. She said she knew that was not an excuse. She said she was seeing a therapist. She said she missed her mother. I read it 4 times. I thought about who Patricia had been at 25 when she would come to my house on Sunday mornings with coffee and sit at my kitchen table and tell me about her plans and her worries and her life. I thought about the years we had had, the real years, the years before the license and the arithmetic. I thought about what Gerald would have said, and I was fairly sure I knew. I waited a month before writing back. Then I wrote 2 pages. I told her I had loved her all her life and was not going to stop. I told her that what she had done was a serious betrayal of trust, that I was not yet done grieving, and that I would not pretend otherwise. I told her the door was not closed, but that it was not open as it had been before, and that if she wanted to walk through it again, she would need to earn that passage, slowly, 1 honest visit at a time. I have seen Patricia 3 times since then. The visits are careful, short. Something in her face has changed, not the light. calculating brightness she carried for years, but something more worn and more real, like a person who has looked at themselves clearly and did not entirely like what they saw. I do not know yet where this goes. I know that I am not the one who will stop trying. What I have now is my house, my oak tree, Gerald's coffee cup in the cabinet, third shelf, right side, the workshop in the basement that still smells of sawdust because I have never cleaned it out, and I never will. Sunday phone calls from Portland, banana bread from next door, and in the second drawer of Gerald's desk, a 3-paragraph document filed on September 12, 1987, with a county recording stamp and my name in Gerald's handwriting. Some people protect the people they love with force, with money, with imposing walls. Gerald protected me with a manila folder and a $40 filing fee, and the quiet, patient certainty that the right piece of paper in the right place, kept for long enough, is one of the most powerful things in the world. I have thought about him every day since this happened, not with grief. Exactly, I am past the sharpest part of that grief. With something more like awe. He did not know what he was preparing for. He only knew that he loved me and wanted me to be safe. And he did the small, careful, unheroic thing that made it so. That is what love looks like when it is serious about its work. Not grand gestures. Not declarations. The quiet action, taken early, that holds when everything else gives way. What would you have done if you had been lying in that hospital bed and received that phone call? I want to know. Leave me your answer in the comments below, and please tell me your age. I read every single comment in these videos, every one, and the answers to that question are some of the most honest things I have ever read. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe and share it if you know someone who might need to hear it. These stories find the people they are meant for. Come back soon. I have another story for you about a man named Howard. He was 83 years old, a veteran and a farmer who had worked the same land for 50 years. His nephew had been quietly, carefully moving pieces of that land into a holding company for 3 years before Howard noticed a single line in a tax document that should not have been there. What Howard did next, over the 18 months that followed, was precise and patient and completely legal, and by the end of it his nephew had learned something about what an old man who has been paying attention can accomplish when he finally decides to act. I will see you then.